All right, welcome to episode 4. Today, we're going to talk about contrast, making our compositions interesting. In the previous episodes, we've talked about how we can organize shapes on our page to tell our story in a more visually dynamic way, making it look good on paper. Now we're going to take a look at different ways, and today is just going to be contrast, of how to take those shapes on our page and make them a little bit more interesting, to tell our story and to just make our shit look cooler, better, easily read by the viewer, and tell our story in a more compelling way. So contrast is one of those ways. There's a bunch more that we're going to talk about. Contrast will be the first one. We're going to take a look. And there's tons of other contrasts. And by contrast, we're going to take a look at 3 right now, and we'll go through more. But I'm talking about light versus dark, large versus small, even things like short versus tall, fat versus slim, black versus white, square versus round. You know, there's tons of contrast that we can talk about. Simple versus complex, hard versus light, soft, tons of them. And they all help to tell our story and make things just more interesting on our page. So let's jump right in and take a look at 3 that we're going to talk about. Light versus dark. Pretty simple, but you'd be surprised at how many people just don't bother to use it. Here's some examples. Meet Schaefer, an amazing artist. Again, all these artists wrote their names down, so you could go check their work because they're all phenomenal. Visit their websites, buy their books. Just awesome art. You can learn a lot from all these guys. So light versus dark, using the light color in this case versus a dark background. This is more of a literal way of putting it. In this case, Dai Susumi uses light in the literal sense against a dark background. So in both instances, this technique is used to tell the story or create a mood or create strong focal points. Use it in any of those ways to make your composition stronger. You can take a look at the other things that he's included in here. The S. We also have... I call this an H because if I imagine it going up, but it can be an O composition with a negative shape back there to pop these guys out and create a stronger focal area. Light versus dark. You can see the 3 spot, 1, 2, and 3. So various different techniques in here to make this, and you can combine all these too. You don't want to confuse it too much with too many ideas. You want to keep it fairly simple, but these all can be combined. So we can see the literal sense of the light versus the dark here to create this this mood. This is for Monsters U. So in the literal sense, using light versus dark, creating strong focal areas because of the contrast, right, of light versus dark. Here we can see a dark shape against a lighter sky by Simon Stellenhag. Awesome artist as well. And again, using that silhouette, that dark silhouette against a light sky, creates a strong focal point. You can't miss this, obviously. It's always cropped as well. So this is the center of interest. But it just makes for a stronger read on the shape and to tell that story of what is going on in this barn, that there's this insane shape, you know, coming out of it. So great use of contrast, light versus dark in these instances. Let's take a look at another one here, large versus small. So we've taken a look at how we can use shape. Let me just grab my... So we can do a simple 3 spot, right? I'm trying to make them all the same shape to make the point. A simple 3 spot. But as soon as we start introducing shape contrast, large versus small, we start making our compositions a lot more interesting. So we still have a 3 spot. Now this is way more interesting than what we just had before. So that simple tweak can make things even more interesting than it was before, even though we had that 3-spot in there. Great use of the 3-spot here. Let me grab a brush. So we have the small shapes of the kids playing in the snow against the large, massive buildings back here. And again, this is a pretty cool story moment that he's created between, you know, the ordinary things that are happening with the extraordinary stuff, which could be another contrast, right, of the story point. But just looking at shapes, we're contrasting those two shapes, creating a story moment here that creates, you know, questions of like what's going on, more interest in it, creates a more dynamic storytelling moment. Here's another piece by, I'm going to try to pronounce this, Szymon Bernacki. Great artist. Check out his work. Phenomenal stuff. And he's really great at creating these story moments that are just awesome and really nice compositions. So again, obviously we have the big shape of that whale against the smaller shape of the boat, playing off of each other and creating this really beautiful story moment. In that one, here's another scene here where the kids, again, being the small shapes against the larger cloud shape, which is, again, a story moment where you have these mammoths back in the cloud formation. Beautiful story moment. And just telling the story through that contrast and others, but using that nicely. Here's a much simpler composition. Small house, large environment, kind of mountain that it sits against. And that itself tells a little bit of a story of the environment, the mood, all kinds of stuff. But if it was simply a big mountain, well, you couldn't have a big house, but another equal shape, you know, being just as equally big, it's just not going to be that interesting. Okay, our last one here, simple versus complex. A lot of people have the tendency, and I do as well, to fill up the screen with as much detail as we can. All kinds of tiny little noise and objects in there, and just fill it with as much as we can, and it really is overwhelming to look at. I have a problem with that. You just got to ring it back in and remember to play that contrast. When there's so much contrast of detail and noise in your shot, it's going to be hard to focus on one thing, to read it nicely, and just have a place where your eye can rest. And this is a really, really a good way to make your compositions read better, have an area where your viewer can rest the eye and direct the attention to the complex area. So here are good examples by Alex Nino, a great artist. These are concepts from Mulan, the Disney film. Phenomenal draftsman, great, just insane drawings. I definitely recommend. And he has some books out there too that you might want to check out. So Google his name, and you'll see some insane shit. All right. Let's take a look. Again, complex form. It doesn't have to be crazy complex. It's not like a crazy rock that has all this tiny noise in it. But what he's doing is just adding some shape. And this is probably the most complex thing in there. With you can see the light versus dark versus light, dark versus light happening in here too. So combining two different elements to make a graphic read on it. So having this complex stuff happening corner frame, and then letting all this stuff in the background kind of fade to a simple shapes in the back, so that we can read our focal point and then kind of flow in to see the army and then rest in the background there. Gorgeous. Again, a little bit more complex now. We have dark versus light, complex forms in here with the leaves, the bark, the branches, all creating a really strong foreground complexity, right, in this shape. And then the simple background of just shapes and fog and mist helps us to just rest up here a little while we're digesting all of this, and then kind of enjoy it and then come back to this focal area again. Simple shapes, the contrast just works beautifully. If this is noisy and then you have all this kind of noise everywhere back here too, it's just going to be too much for our brains to kind of digest and to enjoy. But with this nice balance of that contrast, just makes it sing. Same thing here, reoccurring complex forms in here. We have light against dark, shadows being cast, casting shadows, and just really aggressive, noisy shapes in the foreground. But that creates this nice area where I can rest right here on a simple rock, not too much texture, having that dark against light for that story moment. So combining two different ones to tell that story. All right, so we covered 3, and I want to make these into little digestible pieces, not go on for half an hour, but so you can look at these, go practice them, create little compositions, and then when you come back to the next episode, we'll cover 3 more that you can practice again. All right, we'll see you next episode.